Anyone who got on early already heard the news that there will be yet more Courbet today. You're getting a very ample exposure to his work at the expense of some other very interesting artists. And that's because Courbet just looms so large over what kind of transformations there were in art at the mid-19th century. And he is such a flamboyant character, such a strong personality that his work sort of call for being looked at. So there you're seeing again his sisters in the countryside, these young ladies in the countryside. His first paintings, like would be true in many artists' careers, are the most provocative because these are young people full of zest, full of energy, willing to take on the establishment with all their, whatever their accumulated critique of the establishment is. So, and in Courbet's, it is that the critique was of the need to take the life of the peasants, the life in the countryside, with great seriousness. And that also whatever is visible in the visible world is something that can be a subject of a painting. I realized that I hadn't ever given you this sort of like one-line zinger from him that's most often reproduced. You shouldn't miss out on it. He says, "You want me to paint an angel? Show me one." Well, in the end of his life, he does, he is willing to somewhat temper that emphasis on realism, but it's still pretty strong. And the other thing in showing this to you again that I wanted to re-emphasize was that this like head-scratching peculiarity that how these figures don't fit in the landscape and the things aren't in scale to one another. It's like, what? He may, and he probably did, always have some difficulty since he did not have that traditional training in art. He had some difficulty sometimes integrating figures in the foreground with whatever the setting was. But that wouldn't account for the difference in scale. This is part of his, he's treating as utterly worthy and valid and worthy of being seen in the salon, the style that was more common in folk art and peasant art in the among the totally untrained. So, well, if you think of a lot of folk art, I didn't bring in a Grandma Moses or something. She was not particularly a folk person anyway. But it's quite characteristic, and frequently it is that whatever was considered to be most important would be largest, because it's sort of like a psychological tendency to it looms large in your mind, and it looms larger on the surface. Well, by the later part of the 50s, after his most programmatic, most in-your-face works of art, he begins to somewhat change the style, and he is shifting the subject matter, no more agreeable to many people than the peasants, but the subject matter is often of the omnipresent but ignored aspect of life in Paris, or just life of the time. So these young women on the banks of the Seine, to any Parisian, would be recognizable as that these are fairly high-class prostitutes out enjoying themselves. And they would recognize what to us, and what I for years thought was a dress. Here, those are petticoats. So this woman has actually taken off her dress. still very clothed. And there's a kind of ambiguity about what is the relationship between these two somnolent, dreaming, utterly relaxed women. Then, so that's treating them with a kind of respect and prominence that would not have been expected. And also his style is beginning to change. Well, let's say at least his palette. He's using much brighter colors, and he's interested in smaller luxuries like the bouquets of flowers. So there's a kind of an urbanization maybe in his taste. But within the 60s, in particular, he did a number of paintings that are pretty much confrontations, and they are about sex and sexuality. This one is just called A Woman with White Stockings, and it's from 1861. He certainly could never have done this. We assume he could never have shown this, that this would be something he did for a private patron. Well, it's unbelievably shocking to see the woman from this angle. And what she's doing so casually there, putting one stocking back on and her dress is scattered over her midsection. The implication is, yes, again, you have a prostitute. And here she's getting dressed after having had an encounter. And this encounter takes place in a not very convincing water's edge, but maybe you're to think of that again as along the bank of the Seine. But so to do a figure like this from this angle, which could be found in dirty postcards, but is still just sounds like, what artist was thinking of doing that? Then the one I'm not willing to show you is one called The Origins of the World. I know it's even a book cover, and it's in the Musée d'Orsay, and it's a site of some provocation and controversy still. It's a woman seen, well, the coyest way I can put it is to say from the gynecologist's point of view, and it's from about the level of her breasts down to just slightly past her buttocks. And you're just looking straight on into her. And that also is not certain who that was for, maybe for this Turkish ambassador who was eager to buy the erotic works that Courbet produced. But not all of this one was for that. Not this one, rather. This woman with a parrot, which you will see again, because next week, no matter how far I get today, we will look at Manet, and Manet's extraordinarily provocative nude called Olympia was even done before this. What makes this slightly less provocative? It's just sort of old-fashioned sensuality. She's slightly covered, and the main thing is she doesn't look at us. She is simply, in an old-fashioned, more conventional way, she is there for the man's gaze to enjoy. And then Courbet, as you can see himself, is so much enjoying the long flowing hair, the softness of her skin, the rumpled sheets here, and then there's a kind of an erotic content in the parrot up here. But you see, there's no more of that awkward proportions or dirty colored skin that's so upset. There are early Parisian people looking at that because he's not using so much that black underlayer. And how he's adapting his style for the client, because this is for that ambassador. And it was thought that there was kind of a cliche about the Turks and the life and the harem was opulence, luxury. I mean, Delacroix in the early part of the 19th century were doing paintings that emphasized that about life in the harem. So Courbet is here willing to bend what he does, eager to change what he does to suit his clients' interests. And this one, which is in the Met, simply goes by the title, Woman of the Waves. It's not a particularly big painting. Let's give you the dimensions. 2 feet something, maybe. Yeah, 2 feet by a little more than 1.5 feet. The woman in the water, that does bring up then a mythological context, that's Venus who's born from the waves, but that's certainly that implied connection. There's nothing here that identifies the figure as a Venus. And the totally startling feature is that you see her underarm hair. So that removes it from this realm of soft fantasy or Renaissance idealization. This is, as it were, at least part of a real woman who's simply posed and looking off into space, thinking her own thoughts. The other feature I wanted to bring out, and hope when you go to the museum and you look at this, you will look at carefully, is the way he paints the white foam here. I'll show you another one in a moment he does with white. He has this incredibly individualized technique. When I first was going to the Met, when I was a long time ago, I couldn't bear to look at the Courbets. I mean, they were just too central, too much for touch, and it unsettled me. But this does look like these are flecks of foam that are virtually coming out of the canvas, and certainly spray coming up over the body. It doesn't seem as if it simply depicted foam. When he's using flecks of paint that he puts on, sometimes with a brush, sometimes with a rag, so that you get this very texture, which would be, I think, almost impossible to do if you were using a brush only, not little bits like this. That's like a extraordinary reality to it, which then does something also to the flesh, because this is such a very different treatment from the flesh, that then you begin to think about what it would feel to touch that soft flesh without this random cool spray on it. This, at the very end, you could have seen last week. The model here is a well-known, it's a woman, an Irish woman named Jo Heffernan, who was James McNeill Whistler's lover. And Whistler did a number of paintings of her. And she was, by training, a model. And Courbet seems probably also had a liaison with her for a while Whistler was elsewhere. But so now he's just luxuriating in this hair, as she is too. Now there is one thing that's, you could say, Courbet could be updating into reality something that comes from art and comes from the past, because the theme of a woman looking into a mirror was, as a motif, as an image, often stood for pride. in say, like Bosch's works. There's the image of pride. There's a woman looking in a mirror, and there are many Renaissance paintings like that. So it could have this kind of allegorical meaning as well, or an undertone of it, but the realism of it is the dominant feature. And how differently that same person is represented by Whistler. Whistler's painting is called, well, he originally titled it just Symphony in White, and there was a popular unrest with his beginning to name paintings according to movements in music. And so then he called it A Woman in White or Girl in White. But that's who she is. And you could see this in the Washington National Gallery. The woman is almost full size. We just take this small excursion on this painting. Whistler tried to show it at the Royal Academy in England, rejected. Then he tried to show it in the Salon in Paris, where he was sure it would be accepted, rejected. So rejection was a pretty common story. She's like vapor compared to what Courbet does with her. And then I brought in several of the portraits by Courbet that are in the Met. He from the 50s on, made most of his money from, and he began to make considerable amounts of money from landscape painting. But he also had a steady income coming in from people who've asked him to do portraits. And by the end of the 60s, he started to do flower paintings as well. So that's a long way away from the rustic life in what he's showing. The portraits probably are still owned by the families of the persons depicted. So it tends to be the ones that, for one reason or another, that were rejected, that show up in museums, as this one, which is a lovely one in the Met, of a Parisian woman whose husband commissioned a whole series of portraits of her. And then he just turned around and rejected them all because he would say that they didn't capture his wife's beauty. But what to see there, think back to this photograph of Rosa Bonheur. See, this is the convention. You stand there, it's a kind of a parlor-like setting. She has some accoutrements around her. She stands against something. She doesn't look, it's not a stiff, formal frontal presentation. So Courbet is doing in painting exactly what a photographer of the same time would have done, in the way the figure is posed, the way she looks at you, and the setting. I did mention last time how Courbet said that anything that could be in a newspaper could be the subject of a painting. And he's now equating anything you can put in a photograph, you put in a painting. It's just a different means for representation. Of course, more permanent and more expensive. This was just a woman in a riding costume. It's not known at all who she is. So this is a painting that must have been rejected very early on. The description in the Met points out how radical this would have been in a way that we in our modern lives would not recognize. And that was that for a woman to go riding without a male escort was almost never done. So she is the modern, totally independent woman here presented for you. And there's that way he paints again. See, this is the undercolor. That would have been underlying everything else on the canvas. And then he paints over it. So this area, that's not paint. That's the undercoat. He didn't put a brush of another color over that. She does look out at us. Right. Perhaps with some slight deference in the way her head tilts. But there's great poise. Then we're going to look at some of his landscapes, because what does he put in the middle of his studio of the artist from 1855? That he having painted all of these figures in here, in that way, already displaying what he can do with the human form, showing it clothed and nude, young and old, standing and seated, the whole range of his representational capacities. So what does he do? He shows himself painting an scene out of doors. That in itself is interesting. And as I say, we're going to start looking at his landscapes, but I'll just use this as something that could have said later too. Into this time, even later into the 1870s, possibly later for some people, it was characteristic for landscape artists to go outside, sometimes to sketch, sometimes to make oil sketches of what they saw, but then come back to their studios to make a finished painting, especially if they wanted a painting that could, say, go in the salon, which would mean if you wanted anything seen in the salon, you're going to make a very large painting, which is an awfully cumbersome thing to do outside, especially if you have wet oil paint on it. What are you going to do? You can't move it every day. But so you take your sketches and then you come in and you recompose, edit what you saw, and you produce that final painting, such as this. We'll get to the landscapes. Actually, it's part of the landscapes and part of Courbet's brutally honest understanding of the world. He did a number of paintings of landscapes that focus in the foreground on animals and creatures of the hunt. Now, Courbet himself loved the hunt. He always had. You may possibly remember the first one that he had showed and got a medal for was after dinner around a table at Ornans, where one of the men was a hunter and his dog was there and he had his gun there. So it was just a part of life. This is one that's in the Met, and it's just two of his marvelous dogs, two dogs and a hare. He might be painting something from life here. It's, in this case, we know not, because he used these same dogs in another painting. So he's reusing a sketch that he had made. But now this is a kind of painting that would appeal to, say, fairly aristocratic patron, someone who associated the privilege of going on hunts, not with as a privilege and a sport, rather than going to get something for dinner. And Courbet traveled widely. I went to Belgium, Holland, German, finding clients like that who would be interested in such works as these. So he's out seeking those sorts of commissions. But he is also sometimes very matter of fact about the death. There might be dogs fighting over the dead animal. There are dogs taking down a stag. It's just another part of reality. This one I had to bring in, Fox in the Snow, for the same reason that you were looking at the woman in the waves, because that is this remarkable way he's putting this pure white flux, now flakes of snow, over a fox fur, which looks as if that would be warm and you could just rub your hand right through that fur. Of course, fox is snacking on a rat. So one way we know that Courbet at least made sketches outdoors, in that one you saw before 1854 with his great patron, Alfred Bouillat, is greetings, Monsieur Courbet on the road. Well, what's Courbet? He's got his backpack with all his painting kit. So he's been out. There are known more than 300 landscapes by this artist. He would sometimes come back and do this same subject repeatedly from the same view, and sometimes just slightly shifting according to how it appealed to him. This wouldn't be because some patron is asking him to do this. This one is the view of Ornans, so it's his hometown. You may remember that the river, the Lou River, ran right down through the middle of the town. So there it goes, and the town is recognizable by this really distinctive church tower. And this is an early one, maybe mid-50s, and the Met owns it, but it's not on display. So to just say, here Courbet is following almost age-old convention for landscape paintings, because to give the observer some sense, to aid your imagination, as if you can walk into this painting and walk through the landscape, go see what's behind that tree or follow the river along, you need something that's a kind of a path. So here, of course, he's set up alongside the Lou, and you're looking through. So this goes right through the center of the picture and takes you into the background. And it's very helpful to have a building here and the buildings there, so you can roughly gauge how far into the distance you're looking. So it gives you sort of guideposts for making your way through this. And here's a site that he did again and again and again. It's the source of the water is called the Black Well. I think he did, I don't know, at least more than half a dozen paintings of this, where that kind of escarpment there, of the Jura Mountains, and a few birches here, and the water tumbling and tumbling rocks. Now he doesn't so much give you a distance you can walk into, and the water comes right up to where you are. What that begins to do is, this is like getting you ready for Impressionism too, it's beginning to shift landscape into something that isn't like a vista that you can walk through. This is now beginning to be a painting on a surface, with something at the bottom, something in the middle, and something at the top, not the middle farther away and the top being even further than that. That's this general location now. He's moved slightly and come back and done it in a different season.
Maggie, what is that painting called?
It's one of the 4 or 5 paintings called The Stream at the Black Well of Ornan. And that one, I believe, well, I know it was in an exhibition in the National Gallery in Washington. I don't know if it's in their own collection or not.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And this one is just called A Stream in the Jura Mountains. There's something poignant about this one. This was done shortly after he was released from prison. Remember, I only mentioned this briefly when I first talked about Courbet, that toward the end of his life, he got a little more actively involved in politics at the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, during which Paris actually separated from the rest of the loyalist French and formed its own commune. I mean, they were soon crushed. But so they went for a communal form of government. And during that time, Courbet was made sort of the director of monuments. And he was calling for the tower that was erected to memorialize one of Napoleon's great victories just to be pulled down. And it was pulled down. Now, Courbet did not involve himself in the actuality of pulling it down at all. But when the commune fell, Courbet was arrested for that and jailed for 6 months, then released with a change of government. And then another government came in. They couldn't put him back in jail, but that's when they said they would confiscate all his property. So this is in the interim when he's just out of jail. How could you know that maybe this is a later painting? It's again, even though these are the mountains in the distance, this is getting, the background is coming closer and closer to you. And the surface of the painting is actually coming off the surface into your hands.
Maggie?
Yeah.
Could you just go back about 2? You had
Happy.
a green painting with the sunshine. No,
That one?
No, the one before that.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's a photograph. That's a photograph.
Oh, okay. It's beautiful.
Yeah. I had a whole spiel that I would set to introduce later, but why don't I do it now? We'll leave this one on while I do it. So Courbet was doing landscapes partly for people who were interested in hunting, as he was interested in hunting, and he loved being outdoors and doing that. But among Parisians in particular, there's also a shift happening that was making it possible for him to do 300 paintings. He doesn't have 300 wealthy clients that are going to go for hunting scenes. There was a beginning of a capacity to act on people who live in the city, feeling crowded, oppressed by city life, that they could now get out of the city. And they began to long to get out into the country, which they could on new bus routes, new train routes, the kind of good roads that the stonebreakers were creating for them. So it became a weekend and a vacation thing to do, to go out in the country to restore yourself, mentally and physically and spiritually. So it filled a new kind of longing. See, landscapes before that, you worked in them. You hunted in them. You foraged in them. Where you could, you planted crops in them. So the land was always there for human use, but now the human use is on a non-practical level. And this one is in the map. It's called the source of the Lu. That's that river that goes through his hometown. There's a watermill along the side. Now, this one, you can see not only that foaming, flecking water, but the rough stone walls here. He's using just a palette knife. He's just loading it with paint and just like putting slabs of color on there, which so well approximate in color and the slick surface of those slabs, the surfaces of the stones themselves. And this is the photograph taken from a slightly different angle, so you don't see as much of the mill, but that's the site. There's also a lot of speculation that this can tie in with his interest in women. That's looking at it in a definitely post-Freudian way. It came out of this great cavern. So he did landscapes. He did also do some seascapes, mainly toward the end of his life, but this is an early one from the mid-1850s when he visited his friend Brouillard and went down along the coast, but this town called Palava. And this is fairly small. This is, let's see, 10.5 by 18 inches.
Are those cracks, or is it some kind of
These
decoration?
are cracks. You know you're looking at the original painting here. And
At the
those,
top?
because he has put the oil paints on so thick that as it's dried, it's cracked. And a lot of this is like, he's taken the knife, just gone right across there. Or here.
Where is this one and its name?
It's the C, and then it's Palavas, and you need to go down to Montpellier in southern France to see it.
Beautiful.
That's where his great friend, that patron Brouillard, lived, and has a museum full of his self-portraits and also paintings by Courbet. This one's called Immensity, and it's from 1869. There's several versions he did of this. And this was done on the Normandy coast. Already Delacroix and some other artists were going there to paint nature. And then, of course, the Impressionists are going to, and he will sometimes work adjacent to them a little bit. But in this one, he's moving a little away from actual reality. He's heightening the drama. But what you're seeing is the water's receded, and so this is all damp sand down here. And some of the rocks are showing a little bit of the pool. Only some light coming through. These also sold very well. This was called The Wave from 1870. He did several versions of this as well. Someone recorded staying with Courbet at whatever sort of fisherman's shack. They lived right along the water's edge. They said the storm was so great, that the water would be beating against the windows, and Courbet is in there painting, and then he when it looks like it's going to be dangerous, they all move a little way and then he comes back again. And he's painting with a knife. Well, by knife, they would mean the palette knife. This was exhibited. And this is for the caricature produced for that. Yeah, let me offer you a slice of this painting. I find this one quite poignant. It's a Castle Chillon in Switzerland on Lake Lucerne. So when he was freed from prison and the government had changed and there was this, they're out to get everything he owned, Courbet fled. I mean, he went to Switzerland, where he spent the last few years of his life virtually penniless. And everything that was in his studio was put up for auction. To pay, the money was to go for restitution to rebuild the column in the Place Vendôme. So Courbet did not very much painting during that time, a little. He, with some friends, actually bought an inn and thought they would renovate that, but he died, partly from ill health. But how relatively tranquil this is, but the wonderful range in the colors. And truly, doesn't that look like that surface is reflecting light right at you? It doesn't look like it's paint. So we do at last say goodbye to Courbet and look at Corot. And in some sense, you think, I'm just totally nuts, because Courbet was born before Bouguereau. Corot was born before Courbet, who was born before Bouguereau. But his career has some of the kind of, an interesting trajectory. So he's known primarily as a landscape artist. Here's a photograph of him from around 1850. He became, he was considered the preeminent landscape artist in France by many people in the second half of the 17th century. His, do you want to look at his rather handsome and if stern countenance, or not that? Yes, I think I'd rather look at his countenance. Well, telling you about his biography. He came from Paris. His parents were, in the milliner's business. His mother had a good hat shop, and his father helped run it. By good, I mean that they made millinery for the aristocracy, for the empress. So they made a lot of money. Corot was sent to school, totally indifferent student, sent to work for 8 years as a kind of an apprenticeship with another milliner, not very interested in it, didn't really show a passion for anything until he did declare that he wanted to be an artist. And he knew from the beginning his interest in artists was in the world around us, in landscapes or cityscapes, but not in figures, not in animals, not in mythology. So his parents acceded to his desire, arranged for him to study with a couple of sort of medium range traditional landscape painters. And then his parents paid for him to do what all those poorer students studied at the École des Beaux-Arts or any of those academies were longing to do, which was to go to Rome for 3 years. His parents, to get that prix de Rome so that they could go to Rome, his parents paid for him to go to Rome So he lived in Rome from 1825 to 1828. When he came back, it took a while for his career to take off. By mid-1840s it was, and he was, in fact, one of the people who helped to revise the rules for entry into the salon to make it not quite as conservative as it had been. One of the ones that would be changing the rules so that Courbet was first able to show. And ultimately, he becomes like Bouguereau, a winner of the Legion of Honor, a gazillion paintings by him, even more fakes and more imitations. His work just dominates. So this is the reason I was like, why are you looking at these two together? Remember, this was one Courbet had in the Salon exhibition in 1850 that just agitated the public to such an extreme degree. And that was in the same year Corot showed this. It's nymphs, a morning scene, a dance of the nymphs. So this is going to be his very popular style. This is the style that people who wanted to buy Bouguereau paintings, or Americans in particular in the second half of the century, the paintings like this were the Corots they wanted. But we're going to go way back and show you some early Corots as well. Like this. And this one, let's see, this is dates to around 1830. So he's not too long back from Rome. And it can be dated not, well, here, I think you can't see the date on this, but here's Notre Dame, and the iron spire hasn't even been erected yet. So this is what he loved to do. He would just walk around, whether it was out in nature or in the city. He'd just have a small pad or a kit, sort of like Courbet had, and then sketch whatever he saw. These are what have been so influential for 20th century artists, not the works that were liked in his own day, but these very simple, summary, a few strokes, nice, his wonderful balance of the range of colors and the tonalities, and sort of simplifies them. So, of course, that makes sense when you're doing this, when you're out on the hoof, so to speak. You're not going to be carrying a whole bunch of different colors with you, but it's also his instinct. And the ones that are to modern taste, the most appealing are the ones he did either in his first 3 years in Rome, like this one, or in his subsequent travels in Italy. He traveled a lot, and sort of like Turner in that, and he did landscapes wherever he went. So it's a study of light. Well, that's one reason they all went to Rome anyway, was to get the wonderful Mediterranean light. But he does things like, there are more windows in these buildings than he shows you. He's selectively simplifying and choosing the angle at which he sees these buildings, so that there's just a kind of a terrific harmony in it all. Not absolutely framed at the edges, but you get a slice, and then you can look through at a slightly more distant view here. A wonderful limpid sky. Who does that influence? Cézanne. There's Cézanne from the mid-1880s, or Braque at the very beginning of Cubism. So Corot's work have had a great influence on modern painting. This is not Corot. This is a 17th century painting. But this was the traditional art against which Courbet and then Corot, I don't know if it's say they chafed, but anyway, they moved beyond it. So this is really talking about culture, the culture of looking as much as anything else. This is by Claude Lorraine, primarily a landscape painter who lived, though French, lived most of his life in Rome. And he's did seascapes and landscapes. This is just I just picked up a characteristic example. They tend to be sort of they're constructions. They're not actual renditions. Although he made sketches from the life to make a final painting, there is that, where is the human contribution? You have to have the artist's dominant, the artist's skill, artist's eye, the artist's thinking, the artist's effort. It can't be just nature presenting herself to you. And more than that, it couldn't be just nature. Nature had to be a backdrop for human activity, and the human activity had to matter. So, see, this is the same stuff that Bouguereau is still keeping alive in the 19th century. What matters is ancient history or mythology. So here you have Apollo. Oh, this is the water god right here, but this is Apollo, and then here's Apollo with the lyre and the muses. So you'd imagine the music of the gods. As I look out at a landscape again, you have something so you can move into the distance. There's like sort of a stream that's going to take you back. How do you know you've got the full view? Well, you have something to close it off on one side and close it off on the other. And to work out the distance, there's a temple. There's some structures back here. So you can head off. Or you could put in a biblical subject. This is Jacob going into the land of Canaan in an actually idealized landscape from around Rome. But there are the camels. So this turns us into getting us on our way to Canaan. So this is what you should expect of a landscape. This is what the public would expect of a landscape. Even Dutch landscapes, to some degree, conform to that. And Corot will too. This is one that's in the Met. It's the Hagar in the desert, which is, to my mind, always a horrifying story, from 1835, and it's about 6 feet high. So it's the biblical story of Hagar, Abraham's wife Sarah, unable to bear a child, tells Abraham to have a child with her maidservant Hagar. She does, but then when Sarah has a child, she, in her jealousy and desire to make sure her son takes primacy, tells Abraham to exile Hagar and her son Ishmael into the desert. And Hagar in the desert puts her son Ishmael far to one side where she can't see him because they're dying of thirst. And she grieves. But in her grief, she calls on God, who sends an angel and will provide water and, of course, a life for them. This is a dry water course here. So there is a heart-wrenching story brought to the foreground in this landscape, which still has that golden hues that he sort of brought back from Rome. But, well, of course, he doesn't know what the land of Canaan looked like. He'd never been to the Holy Land. But he's been to the forest of Fontainebleau, which is 30 miles from Paris. And on his many sketching trips, because he loved going there, joining many other artists who, as their escape into the world where there's moral and emotional regeneration, chose that particular forest. 30 miles from Paris. Regret that I've never been there. I hope some of you have. It has a kind of a beach, an inland beach. It's great for rock climbing. There are huge oak trees. There are a sort of mountainous views and then lower areas for trekking. And I'll show you some photographs from Fontainebleau itself. But so Parisian artists were beginning either for summer vacations or for breaks to go there to absorb the natural world. And this, you can see how freely painted it is, because this is just a sketch he's making for himself on paper that then's later put down either on wood or on a canvas to preserve it. But these are the things he would be doing all spring and summer to come back in the winter to make a painting like Hagar in the Wilderness. So now that you see those trees, see? So that's the way the artists would work. They would assimilate these freer works that they'd done outdoors. Now you're at Fontainebleau. That's maybe where we're going to go today. These are. So there's immense variety there. I think it was one of the first intentionally preserved forests anywhere. I think not just in France. I'll give you a couple more of the sketches he did there. Or at least one. This is a rather interesting one. This color down here, before he set out, he put that color under this whole canvas, which is small. Let me see, I'll give you the size on this one. 16 inches, but it's 1.5 feet by 2 feet. So he took this with him, and then he painted these colors over it, leaving, this is an area just uncovered, so it looks yet like another rock. So these are spontaneous works, which then could be combined into something more ambitious. This is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and this was in a salon in 1848, right? No, 1846. It's 4 feet across. This was major because there is no significant human activity in here. There is a cow herd, but just a couple of cattle. But no mythology, no history, nothing enlightening. And this was just about a first for any painting that was to be taken seriously for its size to be produced that way. And Baudelaire, that great friend of Corot, said, Courbet said, Corot stands at the head of the modern school of landscape painting. So his modernity was very clear to them. Yeah, I'll show you this fast. But this is then what he began in the 50s, his style shifts. All those vivid, real things begin to be replaced by paintings that are called recollections, the word for souvenir. They're imagined landscapes in silvery light with a few figures, some wispy trees. They are evocations of mood. They're in an idyllic other world. Like, this is maybe his most famous one of all.
On that one you just showed, was that a kid in the tree?
Yes. And I didn't give you the title of this painting because at first I was like, what? It's the eel gatherers. Because eels, I had to look up, where did you find eels? Well, you can find them anywhere. And they would have wicker baskets, put them in the water, and then collect the eels in them. So here's a basket coming back. And here's the youngster just enjoying himself up here in the tree, I guess. So there's some kind of incident in it anyway. So I stopped with this one and just, no, one more. But it's called a recollection of a place. It's called Mort Fontaine. But look at that from about 5 years earlier than this one. Same trees. What's back here changes. General sense of the composition is the same. Now it's a boatman instead of children playing. So they're generic, wistful, a kind of imagined rather than actual physical escape. And I know it's time for us to escape now. So any questions or anything you want to look at again before I shut them off from you?
Maggie,
Yeah.
how did the rejection process work? If an artist submitted to, say, Museum A and is rejected, would the other and made a subsequent submission elsewhere, would they be influenced by the fact that somebody else had rejected them? How did that work?
See, it's not so much that it's more contemporary, I think, in terms of museum. They were going for that annual exhibition in the Salon where there were thousands of paintings. If you were rejected in that Salon, well, you might be able to find someone to buy it. But that's why these artists just threw themselves blood and guts into this, trying year after year to figure out, what do the judges want? What can I do so that I finally am accepted? Because once I'm accepted in the Salon, I can sell. People will know I'm good because I've been accepted in the Salon. So it was kind of most works are still. It thinks that Met wasn't founded until the 1880s. The Louvre was only 100 years old. There weren't all that many museums. So works were still going primarily either to small local establishments or institutions or to private patrons. Is that answering all around your question rather than your
Yes,
your
yes,
question?
definitely.
Yeah, around your question, but not exactly to your question.
Yeah, it gives me a good sense as to how the system worked with the Salon.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's beginning to, by this time, it's beginning to lose its power because of good old Courbet. When Courbet built his own pavilion, it's sort of like, for the wealthy artists like Monet is going to be, we get next time, maybe I'm not dependent on them. I can arrange my own exhibitions.
Okay.
That's the way it'll work.
Yeah, interesting.
All right. Anyone else? Okay, I'll see you next week then.